Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to all of you from the RVW team. It is my great honor to open this presentation and to introduce you to our two speakers today. We are very, very privileged and honored to be welcoming two of the greatest. We're honored to be surrounded by people of this caliber. The first presentation will be by Andrew Opdyke. Andrew's a CFA, which those of us who don't have one think of as a PhD in finance and economics and portfolio design. He's a senior economist. He's a member of the First Trust economics team, which Bloomberg consistently rates as one of the best financial analysts in the country. We have been fans of and users of First Trust products and funds for years. And those of you who are clients certainly have some First Trust ETFs in your portfolio. We think the world of First Trust and their team, and it's a great honor to have him with us today. He'll be kicking off the presentation. When Andrew asked what I and the team wanted him to address, we said, well, there's a quote that we'd like you to respond to. Warren Buffett says, it's only when the tide goes out that you can see who is swimming without shorts. And what we wanted Andrew to tell us today is, what does it look like when you're swimming with shorts that are tight and won't come off when the turbulent waters arise? In other words, what do shorts look like when they're firmly on? And what are the portfolio design, the elements we should include, exclude, and what we should be prepared for in the coming year in this radically altering environment? Andrew, as I said, has got an MBA. He's well-trained, Northwest University's Kellogg Graduate School of Management. He has a BA in Business and Economics as well. And as you know, he is a CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst. He will be kicking off the presentation today, after which we'll have Steve Siegel, who has a JD LLM. He's a Harvard graduate. He has an LLM in tax from the New York University Law School. He really is a lawyer's lawyer, and he'll be making things very presentable and very understandable to us. But he has written authoritative textbooks for lawyers and deals with CPA and legal professionals almost all the time. He obviously has his own practice as well, but his real focus is working with other professionals. Today, he's going to be responding to the quote, and you'll notice there was a quote to which Andrew will be responding. The quote that we've asked Steve Siegel to respond to is the quote that says, surprises are for birthdays, not for tax time. And what can we do to minimize the surprises and to optimize tax saving, estate tax saving strategies as we sit at the cusp of changes in the tax law, changes in the estate planning law, and what kind of actionable ideas can we learn from these two gentlemen to help us navigate the waters in the year ahead? And with that, I turn over to Andrew. Andrew, thank you for being with us. It is a great honor to have you with RVW, and we know we're in great hands. Looking forward to some good, well-researched insights and information that we know will be handy in the coming year. Thank you so much for honoring us with being with us.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. It is great to be joining you today. We have a lot to talk about. Obviously, it has been a very volatile year. And this year, from a market standpoint, from an economic standpoint, a geopolitical standpoint, there have been no shortages of things to be concerned about. And as the question at the beginning mentioned, during times like this, as the tides go out, you see who has their bathing suit on, how well those are fitting. A lot of things get put to the test. And what I want to talk about, what I want to focus on to start is, kind of what is leading the activity right now? What is at the center, right? The center of the economic and market environment. And that in 2022 has so heavily revolved around the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, that interest rate setting body here in the United States, the group tasked with managing inflation as well as employment, they have gotten put to the test. This year, they've seen the tide go out, and some of their theories on where we would be both last year and into this year have been seriously questioned. Let's take a look real quick at how this year has progressed and how much the Fed's viewpoint and with it the market expectations have shifted with it. If we go back 1 year today, okay, come back with me in time. Let's go back to November of 2021. The Fed's latest forecast that they had given us in terms of what to expect in 2022, they said, look, inflation at this point, they were still saying it's transitory. It's temporary. Okay. They were saying maybe we have to do something in 2022, but if we do, it's going to be very modest. We're thinking maybe we have to raise rates by 1 point. Okay, one rate hike, 0.25%, which is historically a very low level. The market said, hey, you know what? We're not worried about that. That's not going to really impact the economic environment. It's not going to really impact business investment. Well, as we progress, we get into December of last year. And in December of last year, one of the things the Fed constantly deals with is that they are every other meeting having to put out forecasts. Where is inflation going to be? Where is GDP going to be? Where is employment going to be? Where do they think they need to be? That's where these numbers come from. Well, in December of 2021, we got to check on how well the prior year's forecast had gone. How well had 2021 played out based on what the Fed had expected? And as we got the data in 2021, here's where we stood. Okay, at the end of December 2020. Looking forward to 2021, the Fed said, here's what we expect to see. We will see the employment picture return, the jobs will come back, the supply chain will ease, and with that, inflation will come down to their forecast for last year was 1.7%. 1.7%. Now, here they stand in December of last year. And you know what? To their credit, they did get one of the numbers right. There was a 7 in the final number, but it wasn't 1.7%. We stood at 7.0% inflation. So with that, the Fed said, okay, maybe we need to move a little bit faster. We're going to move maybe 3 hikes in the next year, and the markets start to react a little bit. They said, okay, the Fed is changing their outlook. They're starting to adjust. They're starting to take inflation more seriously. Then we get into this year. And as the year kicks off, we get into January, February, we start seeing the geopolitical issues arise. We start to see things like Russia and Ukraine. And the Fed said, hey, this is going to impact energy prices. This is going to impact food prices. Zero COVID policies out of China, that is going to impact the supply chains. They said, you know what? Maybe inflation is going to be a bigger issue than we thought. They go from 7 hikes in December or 3 hikes in December to saying maybe 7 hikes. Maybe we're going to have to move a bit more aggressively when they met in March. Now, at this point, the market starts to get a little bit concerned. If you remember, the first half of this year, we start seeing a real pickup in volatility. We start seeing the markets pare down because they have this concern. If the Fed is getting more aggressive on interest rates, they're making it more expensive as they raise rates to borrow and buy a house, to borrow and buy a car, to borrow and invest in a business. And historically, as the Fed does this, as they chase inflation, try to combat inflation, it has a slowdown effect on the economy. Now, the year as it continued to progress, the Fed has, again, the next meeting, June, they go from 7 hikes to 13. Inflation is clearly not subsiding as they anticipated. And even the hikes they've done up to that point are not having the desired impact. From June, they go to September, from 13 hikes to 17 hikes. Now, we will get another set of numbers in December, but the market has kind of remained spooked. It's had its ebbs and its flows because it says, nobody is really quite sure how high the Fed is ultimately going to go, how long they have to hold it there, and when interest rates can start to come back down. And they know, again, from history that these higher interest rates have economic consequences, but the Fed is stuck between a rock and a hard place. They know if they do not combat inflation, they have history, they have the 1970s. If you don't get inflation in check, it can turn into a significant issue from both an economic and a market perspective. You have to quench inflation if you stop too soon. And this is what we saw during parts of the 1970s, is that the Fed combated inflation, the economic environment hit turbulence, unemployment started to rise, and they stepped back. They said, you know what, we're not willing to take some of that economic pain. We're not willing to see some of the turbulence in the environment, so they eased up. And they lowered rates again. They tried to support the economy, and inflation once again reared its ugly head. Now, at the last meeting, every other meeting, the Fed puts out these forecasts. About a week and a half ago, the Federal Reserve Chair, Jerome Powell, came out and said, hey, now we think this number's too low. We thought this year we weren't going to have to do anything, then maybe something, and then start to get aggressive. Even at this level, 7 hikes, a pace that is well above what you would expect to see in a normal year. And then we saw that wasn't having the impact, so we went higher and higher. And the question for the December meeting is, when is the Fed going to know their job is complete, and are they going to overshoot? Now, the market, this has significant consequences. As interest rates rise, it impacts some companies, some sectors, some industries more so than others. You've seen that with the way that certain growth-oriented companies that rely on these cash flows, a large investment to grow into the future, they've been hit particularly hard this year. You've seen some of the, let's call them the non-sexy areas of the market, things like materials, things like utilities, weathering the storm a little bit better. But the market is ultimately wondering, and the million-dollar question is, when will inflation be in check? And this model that the Fed had of get the jobs back and the supply chain will be fixed, this model, I think, is now largely out the window, because here we stand today, and we actually have more people working than we did pre-COVID. Are they in the same industries? No. Are they in the same sectors? The answer is no. When we had this period, March and April of 2020, we lost 22 million jobs over the span of 2 months. Okay, to put that in perspective, it's a near tripling of the job losses that we saw back during the financial crisis. Okay, and that job loss period took place over the span of 2 years. This was much quicker. It was much more severe. And while the jobs have been coming back, we've seen distortions. We've seen dislocations in terms of where workers went. Think back. I mean, we will never forget March and April of 2020. Throughout our entire lifetimes, it was such a unique moment in human history. The world stopped. The world changed how it was operating, right? And during this time period, we saw some major shifts in terms of where the workers could operate. When the hardware store down at the corner was closed, the restaurants were closed. You saw very few people traveling through the airports, going to the hotels, going to the rental cars. Well, workers needed to find something to do. And in many cases, they moved towards sectors, industries that were able to operate through this. And they were operating. Let me show you, for example, this is retail sales. And we got data on retail sales this morning. I need to add that in here. It ticked up a little bit more for the month of October. But take a look at retail sales. And what you can see is that impact of March and April not only hit the employment side of the equation, it also hit the production side. It hit the purchases side. In March and April of 2020, people weren't sure, am I allowed to go outside? Am I allowed to go to the grocery store? Am I allowed to pick up from a restaurant? We weren't really sure, so we hunkered down and we held back. But, okay, when we got back to things, the response was swift. And here's an incredible number to me. By the end of 2020, we were back in spending at new highs. And this is kind of an incredible thing when you stop to think about it. How did we go through this environment where we lost the jobs? And even as we stood there at the end of 2020, we were still down about 10 million jobs. How were we spending at new high levels? Not just in terms of where did the money come from? We'll get to that in a moment. But how did we have the capacity to interact? And I want to stop here for a moment, because this is one of those things that we often lose sight of during periods of turbulence. We get caught up very frequently in the downturns. They're sharp, they're severe, they're jarring, but don't lose sight of the progress that takes place over time. You have been rewarded, investors have been rewarded over time for patience in the markets, and that's something I think that's going to come in valuable right now. And I want to remind you, okay, let's think about, I was out the other day, it was my wife's grandfather, his 98th birthday. And my daughter, she is 8 years old. I'm watching a 98-year-old and an 8-year-old have a conversation. And my daughter is asking him, Grandpa Doll, what Disney shows did you like to watch when you were growing up? And Grandpa Doll looks at her and says, honey, well, when I was your age, we didn't have TVs and we didn't have Disney. She was a little confused. She's like, oh, okay. Well, if you didn't have TV, what games did you play on your mom's phone? And he just kind of chuckles and he's like, honey, that we lived in a different world. Me and my friends, we would go out in the alley and we would play stickball, and it was a very different world. And I'm watching and I'm thinking about how different life is today versus when he was her age 90 years ago. But we don't even have to go back that far. Think for a moment with me. What if COVID had happened back in the year 2000? What if 99, 2000 we had gone through this type of environment. You remember this time period. This is when we were dealing with Y2K, right? And people were concerned that the 99 was going to change to the 00, and CNN ran a special saying the U.S. missile system might shoot off. And emotion was high. Fear was high. The unknown was dominating conversations. It was bringing volatility to the markets, to the economy. Okay. And I remember exactly where I was on 12/31/99. I was born and raised in the west suburbs of Chicago. I was in a town called Naperville, Illinois, about 26 miles straight west of downtown. And on 12/31/99, we're downtown watching our own mini version of a ball drop. Okay. And there is a tension in the air. People are watching the ball and they're wondering, when it hits midnight, are the lights going to go out? Is my VCR going to start blinking midnight and that tape I picked up from Blockbuster is not going to work? Right? And we had no idea. And the clock hits midnight and nothing happens. Right? And I'm thinking about this as I'm watching my daughter and my wife's grandfather have this conversation, and it hits me. I said, wait a second. I was in Naperville, Illinois, which is in the central time zone, which means that midnight had already happened on the East Coast an hour earlier. Why was it that back in the year 99, as we turned into 2000, why were we downtown still so worried? Because that couldn't happen today. Now, when something happens, you've got 6 alerts on your phone within a minute, 5 minutes max. Today, we wouldn't have that. We would know as soon as something happened in the first spot to hit midnight. But you think back 20 years prior to COVID, and we didn't have smartphones. Over the next 20-year period, all of a sudden we got access to devices, to information, to technology that meant we walk around today with more capacity, information in our pockets than the president of the United States had 20 years earlier. And I think back to what else wasn't there in the year 2000. My wife is a 4th grade teacher. During COVID, her classroom moved inside. It moved online. She went to Google Classrooms. That didn't exist in the year 2000. Neither did the WebExes or the Zooms or the FaceTimes, our ability to connect. There was so much progress that took place in that company that so many of us went to, including workers. When you couldn't go to the hardware store down at the corner and you needed to replace a light fixture or a ceiling fan, so many people went to places like Amazon. Just 20 years earlier, Amazon was a bookseller, competing with Barnes and Nobles and Borders. And this is something I don't want to lose sight of. There's going to be times of turbulence, and we're going through some of those right now. And some industries are going to be hit, and some industries are going to have these pullback periods. It's a very emotional time whenever these massive fluctuations take place. But don't lose sight of the process that moves us forward over time. Those gears of motion, that constant standing on the shoulders of the giants before us, that puts us in a position that once we get through this, and we will. We saw significant inflation in the 70s into the early 80s. We got through it. We grew, and we've seen massive improvements, production growth since that time period. We actually saw a very similar period in terms of inflation and supply chain dynamics immediately following World War II. And there is this transition, this turbulence period. But one thing that history shows us is patience through that time, patience through the emotion is rewarded. Now, on the inflationary front, there's something else I want to note on this chart, because right over here, you see this jump. You see a jump in 2021 in consumption. And when I saw this, it made me nervous. Because what led to this is something that we had learned about in the CFA program, something that we had heard about when I did my MBA at Northwestern, and I did a focus on economics. At the very last economics course that we took, the professor said, hey, we're going to let you in on a theory. You've taken microeconomics, you've taken macroeconomics, you've taken all of the statistics courses. I know this idea is complex, but you're ready for it now. Here's something you may see tested in your lifetime. We want to make sure you know this debate has existed. Well, it turns out here we stood in 2021 and the theory got tested. And the theory, well, complex. Okay, so bear with me for a moment. This is what the theory suggests. If you give people money, they will spend it. And I know it's shocking to some people, but the checks as they came through the system led to an immediate response. In fact, this was the $600 check, the $1,400 check. We saw an immediate response, an immediate pickup in activity. However, That was not going to be sustainable. And my concern was we're adding money to the system at a time where employment is down. You've got supply chains constricted, production constricted, and we're increasing demand. What this was, in my opinion, was an economic morphine. It was a painkiller meant to help us get through this difficult time period. However, with a morphine, okay, if you don't fix the underlying issue, when it starts to wear off, you have two choices. One, you keep adding more morphine. You add it in larger doses because that's what's needed in order to keep the pain away. Well, that wasn't really an option. Okay. The other option is you let the morphine wear off, you work on fixing the underlying issue, but pain will be there. And that's something that we're going through right now. The checks are behind us. The growth pace has returned more towards a historically normal level. That's necessary, that's required. But what this brought with us is inflation. I mean, think about this. Let's logically think through what's happening from an inflationary standpoint. Imagine for a moment we lived in a world that only had two things. It's got $10 and it's got 10 apples. Let's assume for a moment this was the entire world. And think to yourself, in this type of world, how much would an apple cost? And the answer is $1. Right? $10, 10 apples. The apples will be purchased. And maybe this apple, people think that one looks really good. So they spend a little more than $1 on that one. But if they spend a little more than $1 there's only so much money left. Okay. And the other apples, ultimately, at the end of the day, they're going to average out to $1 per apple. This is where we stood in 2019. And now let's think about what happened when we go through into 2020 and into 2021. Well, that governmental response, first thing we saw is the dollars entering the system. And this is a bit of a dislocation. This is something that we really have not seen. Money entering the system in this magnitude has only happened one other time in the last 100 years, and that was 1942, 1943, as we were financing World War II, hence why I think that post-war period is a period that we should pay some attention to. The money comes into the system, and the Fed says, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And some people didn't. They said, okay, Fed, we trust you. We believe you've got this under control. And during this time period, this money started promoting demand for new goods. And we said, look, there's these new companies that are forming in response to the pandemic. The world around us has changed because of the pandemic. What we buy, how we buy, who we see. And yes, some of that was true, but we also started to price some companies to pandemic perfection. That the world had changed and we weren't going to go to retail stores anymore. Everything was going to happen online. We weren't going to be on the airlines, the hotels. We weren't going to need the rental cars. We were going to do projects in our backyard. And that led to some dislocations, some turbulence in the markets in terms of where cash was allocated. Now, the Fed said, don't worry about that. What you need to focus on is the apples. We get the apples back, and ultimately things will even themselves out. And I said, well, hold on a second. Let me think about this because if I run the math on this, if we've got $13 and the apples are fully returned, if we get the same production levels, the same environment that we had pre-COVID, well, in this environment with $13, more money, chasing the same number of apples, it seems to me that inflation is necessary. With $13 and 10 apples, you're going to get $1.30 per apple. And I actually brought this to the Fed. I had tried for about 2 years to have a sit-down conversation with somebody from the Fed. About a month ago, I got that chance. I sit down with a Fed board governor. This is one of the people in the rooms where the discussion takes place, one of the people that votes on policy. And I asked, what am I missing in this evaluation? And they said, yes, there was $13 in the system. And they said, hey, remember, we didn't vote to add the money. That's Congress. Congress has the decision. They make that choice. We have to react to what's in front of us. And I said, okay, but you've got more money. And they said, yeah. And then we were sitting there and we didn't have 10 apples. We had 5, right? The other apples that were lost, again, as the Fed, they said, we didn't vote on this. This was decisions by the health department, by the administration. What we do is respond to the world around us. And with $13 and 5 apples, the inflation pressures were massive. And they had to ask themselves, what can we do as the Federal Reserve? So what they said is, let's get these apples back. This is a key lever for bringing inflation pressures back down. Could you take the money out of the system? No, not really. I mean, theoretically, yes. Congress could issue a bill. They could have done it earlier this year and said, everybody we wrote a check to, just go ahead and write it back. Right? That was never going to happen, particularly in a midterm election year. And quite honestly, the Fed didn't want that to happen because they remember the 1930s. as money was pulled out of the system. Now, back then we had bank runs. Back then we didn't have the FDIC insurance, but they said, we don't want to take these dollars out of the system. It causes economic hardship. Get the apples back. And that's going to help ease inflation. So what do? They said, in order to support the apples coming back, we drop interest rates to zero. We incentivize people to borrow and buy a house, borrow and buy a car, borrow and invest in a business. And as they do that, yes, we move. From this $13.05 apples, we get the apples back, and it brings us here. We've gone from $13.05 apples to $13.10 apples. The problem was we were never going back to our original environment. And the reason is that easing the supply chain never does anything to take this additional money out of the system. Now, if we could get 3 more apples, if the production had grown at the same pace as the money, then inflation pressures would have been modest, but that was not possible. Increasing output by 30%, we haven't seen that. Not in the last 10 years, 20, 30, 50, 80, 100 years. We haven't grown at that pace in such a short time period. And now here we stand, and the apples are back, and the Fed is saying, look, the job market is tight. We have difficulty finding more workers. There's not a lot more that we could do to stimulate activity to get these apples. Now our focus switches to this side. We need to focus on preventing more dollars from entering the system, and therefore they act. How do they do it? They raise interest rates. They make it more expensive to borrow and buy that house. We see home sales moderate. It's more expensive to borrow and invest in a business. Business investment moderates. So what we're constantly looking at now is this movement in interest rates, and we see it through the 10-year Treasury. We see it in corporate borrowing costs. It has roiled the market substantially, and it will have an impact on corporate earnings. What we have to do in this environment is say, who can continue to operate through this? Some companies are more impacted, some are less. During periods where money is incredibly cheap, more speculative, high risk, high growth assets, they can perform very well. In this type of environment, you need a little more ports in the storm. Now, on the earnings front, and this is my last slide, this is already, I know, a lot of listening to an economist on any given day. Let me wrap up by showing you what's happening on the earnings front. Unlike the financial crisis, where it took us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to come back and start setting new highs. This was the recovery from the financial crisis, slower down, slower up. Then we had the recovery. You can see the impact, for example, from the tax hikes. Tax is incredibly important. Steve, who's going to be up immediately after me, has a lot of really good information in terms of how do we operate, leverage, manage that side of the equation. What's happening in the earnings side, the market side right now? Well, earnings did fall going into COVID. In fact, they fell back to roughly where they were before the tax cuts went into effect. What happened last year? Well, earnings rose. We went from $155 per share in 2019 to over here, we're at about $200 per share last year, the year that's in the books. The key questions are, where do we go from here? And coming into this year, market expectations were that we would see 10, 12% earnings growth this year, and then 5 to 10% the following year. A continued rise, because again, they said, look, the Fed is telling us 1 rate hike. Okay, maybe now they're telling us 3 rate hikes, but at less than 1%, this is still historically easy. As those interest rates have risen, these numbers have been pushed down. Now, this year's number is still expected to be positive, just not as positive as last year. Next year is where it's really feeling it. And again, what's happening here is that unknown is taking over from a market perspective. And what I would say is when the tides are coming out, the Fed is being tested. The markets are being tested. The economy is being tested. Those swimsuits that look the best when the tide go out are the ones that have some protection, that take into account the fact that uncertainty is always part of the equation. They're the companies that say, look, they might not be the most exciting, they might not be the high flying, but the value type companies, the utilities, the materials, the healthcare that produces revenue, that pays off dividends, the cash producers, they hold up better in this environment. And what we're seeing today, when the tide goes out, asset allocation becomes incredibly important. Being intentional about the types of companies that we invest in, being intentional about the sectors with the exposure. Now, I will say this, and I'm going to bring down my screen, and Steven's going to be on in just 1 minute. As I close up, I think this is a critical time. The conversations you have with the RVW Wealth team, this is the time, those conversations are so important because emotions run so high. Emotions come to the forefront when we run through these periods of turbulence, but it's exactly during these high emotion, high volatility time periods that the plans you made before, because we can't time the market. I can't time the market. You can't time the market. In my view, the Market Timing Hall of Fame is empty, but you will be. You will be rewarded for time in the market. You are rewarded for patience. You are rewarded over time. And those plans you made before any of this started are your best path towards that longer term success. We get to have these conversations with your team on an ongoing basis. I appreciate the chance to be able to share some of our conversations with you today. With that, I'm going to be passing things over to Steve Siegel, who's going to take things from the tax side. So, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Excellent discussion, excellent information, a lot to think about. So my role is to talk about income tax and estate tax and planning to see where we go from here. And a lot of us who are involved in this world had hoped that the election would give us clear direction as to where tax law would be, at least for the next 2 years until we have another election. Well, that hasn't happened. Everything is very close. We can't be certain that with the narrow majorities that are out there, that each party will vote 100% with their own members to make sure that we can have reasonable expectations. So once again, as tax planning goes, everything is up in the air. A lot of it is uncertain. So what do? One of the things that all of us should think about is basic planning. What we learned in the pandemic, sadly, was that many people did not have any planning in place, or the planning they had was inadequate. People died with having done no planning, thinking, well, I'm young, I don't need to worry about that yet. Older folks died thinking, well, when I get around to it, I'll fix what I had done earlier. None of that happened. And so what we need to remind our clients about is at least satisfy your basic planning requirements. Do you have a will? Do you have a living trust? In either of those documents, have you indicated what should happen to your assets? Who should be your beneficiaries? Do you have beneficiaries who are appropriate outright recipients of your assets, or should they be those assets held in further trust? Are the beneficiaries mature, responsible, etc., or are they, in some sense, need to be taken care of a bit? That is a basic assumption. If you've had multiple marriages, if you're leaving everything to your current spouse, that might mean that your children from earlier marriages won't get to inherit any of your property. So we have these blended families of widows, widowers, divorces, where we need to be careful that we are taking care of our current spouse as we wish to do, but also we are making sure that children of prior marriages are also considered as part of our plan. We found during the pandemic that people did not have durable powers of attorney in place, meaning that if they became incapacitated or disabled, no one was authorized to act on their behalf. That's not good. An immediate power says, I sign it, someone can act immediately. A springing power says you need 1 or 2 physicians to certify that a person is in fact disabled. The advantage of the springing power is if you don't trust your immediate person without the doctors involved, you get that safeguard. The disadvantage is timing. By the time you find 1 or 2 doctors to examine someone and write a letter, the urgency of getting something done may have passed, and that's a problem. So I personally favor the immediate. Living wills and healthcare directives, do you have one? Do you have a statement to your family that says, this is how I want to be handled, treated, should I become in a grave medical situation? Express your views. When was the last time you updated your life insurance policy, your retirement plan? People sometimes get a job, they fill out their forms with HR and they disappear. Those forms disappear in the files. They're still with the same company years later. Has anything changed? Same spouse, same children. You feel the same way about children. Did you name your estate as the beneficiary? That's a planning mistake. All these things need to be addressed. People's lives change. The relationship between people and their spouses, their children, sometimes change over time. Have you addressed that in your documents? Who did you pick as the people to manage your affairs? Executor, trustee, guardian. I have clients that when a child is born, they name their parents as the guardians, should they not be around, or their parents are of an age where they could handle children. 10 or 15 years later, those people are teenagers, and now your parents are in their 70s perhaps. Can they manage a teenager? Maybe not. You got to rethink all these things. One more point, formulas. I get clients come to me and say, well, I signed my will 20 years ago, but nothing's changed. I have the same spouse, same kids, everything's fine. Do I really need to have this discussion with you? And I read the document and it says something like, upon my death, I leave my children the maximum amount of wealth that can pass without federal estate tax and the balance to my spouse. In year 2000, that was maybe $675,000 to the children, everything else to the spouse. Now it's $12,060,000 to the children and everything else to the spouse. And people look at each other and say, what everything else? Well, these are issues that need to be addressed. This does not require sophisticated planning other than getting some planning done. Will we see tax law changes in 2022 or now in 2023? Who knows? It's not clear. The BBB, the Build Back Better plan, was on the back burner. Will it be brought forward now that the Senate has a couple more votes perhaps than it had last year? Maybe the Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, they may not be required to pass a law now. That could change things. But now we have the House that looks like it may go Republican. They may not agree to pass any tax law. So we're uncertain where this is going. We've had a couple of years of tremendous planning uncertainty. We've been telling clients, do things now before the law changes. The law hasn't changed quite yet, but we've made clients work and make them pay for things that we've done. Are they fatigued? Do they want to keep thinking about planning? What should we tell them? There's also the danger that if the Senate and House can't agree on tax law changes, there may be some aggressive regulations issued through the administration pressuring the IRS. Some of those regulations will be allowable and some will not be. Some will require a legislative change, not an administrative announcement. But they may pass those regulations anyway and then let the side that doesn't like them challenge them in court. So we have all this uncertainty. The other piece of uncertainty that we have is the fact that the 2017 Act, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, sunsets at the end of 2025. So we have an exclusion from estate tax in 2022 of $12,060,000 going up to $12,920,000 in 23, but then falling in 26 to around $7 million. Not that everyone has 7 million and has to worry, but a lot more people are between 7 and 13 or 14 than they are at 14 or higher. So these are going to be issues that we need to think about sooner rather than later, because if we wait and it turns out that the sunset becomes effective, should we start planning in November of 2025? That's going to be a little late. Lawyers, appraisers, accountants are all going to be very busy then. Beyond busy. So we need to start thinking about that sooner rather than later. But then we have the 24 election ahead of us. What will that do? Maybe that will immediately drop the exclusion if one side wins. Maybe it will increase the exclusion if another side wins. And maybe it'll do nothing. It'll just let the sunset go on. We don't know. We can't answer these questions for clients. Some people worry about retroactive tax laws. We were concerned about that when the new administration took over in 2020. The U.S. Supreme Court has held in cases that if you can show a legitimate legislative purpose, tax laws can be made retroactive. That sometimes can create enormous complications. You make a gift in January and you think you're not paying tax on it, and you find out in February or March that they made something retroactive and now you owe tax. You wouldn't have made that gift quite so big, perhaps. So it's very awkward to permit retroactive changes. Where it's been allowed, it's been on relatively narrow, minor grounds. So one would hope they would not disturb a lot of things that are out there. As I mentioned, in 2022, this $12,060,000 exemption, married couples can give away or die with over $24 million. That's a number we've never seen before. But again, the sunset in 26, at one point we thought it would be about $6 million a person. Through inflation, we're looking at maybe $7 million a person will be the number. The Biden plan said, let's go back to 5 million right away. So will we see 12 million? Will we see 24 million for a married couple? We don't know. 2022, maybe into early 23, could be the last chance opportunity to make larger gifts if somehow the government decides to reduce these numbers. And that is never off the table. We're never quite sure where they're going to go with some of these laws. The good news is that nothing is going to be clawed back. They made it clear that if you make a gift this year of $12 million and the exclusion goes down to $7 million in a few years, the fact that you gave 12 will not penalize you in any way. You won't have to pay tax on the extra 5 that you gave away. If they drop the number to 7, you're not going to have another 7 to use. You've used 12, you're done. But at least this is something to be thinking about. I recommend to clients that at whatever level of wealth you are, consider making gifts sooner rather than later. Why? Because your property may appreciate over time. If you live 20, 30 years, your property may be a lot more valuable in the future than it is today. And who knows what the law will be in 20 or 30 years. I can't tell you what it's going to be in 20 weeks, never mind 20 years. So the sooner that we act to do everything we can do now to defer, eliminate future taxation seems to be a good idea. I have some clients that have large wealth, but they say, I have no liquidity. My life is tied up in real estate, securities, etc., so I can't make gifts. I suggest, well, borrow money and make the gifts with the borrowed funds. And then if you die and the money hasn't been paid back, that debt that you have is potentially a deduction from your taxable estate. The phrase use it or lose it with some of these exclusions becomes relevant. Maybe not tomorrow, but not months and years from now. Don't get the clients thinking appropriately as we go forward. We can make annual gifts to as many people as we want, as long as it's a present value. That means cash or an asset that they have some control over. In 2022, the number is $16,000 per person, as many people as you wish. If you're a married couple, it can be $32,000 per couple to as many people as you wish. The 2023 number will be $17,000. You can't carry over an unused gift. So you make a gift in December of 16, you can make a gift in January of 23 of 17. That removes significant money from your estate. Maybe you have multiple beneficiaries, children, grandchildren. You can remove a lot of money from your estate if you're comfortable doing that. So these are things to be thinking about. The Biden proposal suggests that if you make a gift of appreciated property, that's a taxable event. So if you bought your Apple stock at 50 and now it's worth 150 and you give it away, you have to pay income tax on 100. That's not the law yet. That would only be made law upon enactment. When does enactment occur? When both houses of Congress pass a law and the president signs it. That's not happening anytime soon. But if it does happen, we're going to lose the opportunity to avoid having that potential tax be paid. One of the planning opportunities I've mentioned to clients is we normally think of splitting gifts. If you live in a community property state, gifts of community property are automatically split. But when you deal with separate property, each spouse has to agree to split the gift. There has to be a consent. I'm recommending to clients use separate property and have spouse A make a gift of that property without spouse B joining the gift. So give your 10 million, 5 million, whatever amount you're willing to give it to children, grandchildren, a trust for them, give it to them without splitting the gift. Spouse A gives 10 million, B gives nothing. If they drop the exclusion to 5 million, A is done. B is made no gift. If they split the gift at 5 million each, they're both done. Your donation to your family is capped at 10 million. In my example, spouse A gave 10, B has still 5 available. That means another 5 could be given in the future. That'd be 15, obviously better than 10. People say, well, yeah, but what if B dies and didn't make a gift? Not a problem. Sad for B, obviously, but portability saves the day. What does that mean? Portability means that if a person dies and they leave their assets to their spouse, they've not used their transfer tax exclusion. And all you have to do is file a federal estate tax return, Form 706, and now you get the ability to have the unused exclusion of the first decedent passed to the survivor. Technically, it's called DSU, deceased spouse's unused exclusion. So if a person died this year with 12 plus million available, left everything to spouse, no exemptions been used, no exclusions been absorbed. 12 million passes to spouse. Spouse lives until 26 or 27. Now the exclusion 7 million. Spouse has 19 million to address. If you don't file the 706, the spouse would have 7 million to address if the sunset occurs. You have to file a 706 when you have an estate over the 12,060,000. Otherwise, it's voluntary. The IRS now has extended the opportunity to file Form 706 to get portability with no user fee, meaning you don't have to pay the government for the privilege of allowing this to happen. It had been 2 years under Rev Proc on 2017-34 that you see on the slide. Now it's 5 years. A new revenue procedure was issued a few months ago. That's 2022-32. And now you can have 5 years to file a 706 from the date of a person's death if it wasn't originally required. And you don't pay a user fee. Otherwise, you pay a user fee in 2022 of $12,600 for exactly what you could have gotten for free. That's not a good idea. So encourage your clients where there's been a decedent and a married couple. Encourage clients to file that 706, even if it's not required. Pay someone to do it. It's like an insurance policy. Once you have the DSU, that limits the potential federal estate tax when the second spouse dies. And that's not clawed back either. Once you get the DSU, it's locked in until you use it. So these are planning opportunities. All the things we've been able to do for the last 20 or 30 years are still available. We still have fair market value at death as the basis to an heir. They haven't increased the income tax rates as they've threatened. These highly sophisticated, fancy planning techniques that we use for the wealthiest clients, GRATs, IDGITs, things of that nature, are still around. We had low interest rates, not so much anymore. Certain techniques are less desirable now that interest rates are rising. We can still claim valuation discounts. We give away pieces of a partnership to our children, to our grandchildren. We can claim 20, 30% discounts and reduce the transfer tax potential on those gifts. The administration is fighting all these things. They're trying to change these rules. We can create a multi-generation dynasty trust where children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond can be given interest in the trust that under current law will never be subject to transfer tax again, no matter how large they become. So all these things are possible. One thing I recommend to build basis is what I call upstream planning. Think about this. You have an older family member and you have securities you bought at a very favorable price and now they've highly appreciated. You don't want to sell them and pay the capital gain tax. What can you do? Give them to your elderly family member. Give them to grandma. Grandma hopefully is healthy. Grandma doesn't have a taxable estate. Grandma holds them until she passes. And when she passes, she gives them back to the person that gave them to her, her son or daughter. If she lived more than 1 year from receiving those assets, the son or daughter get it back with a fair market value at grandma's death basis. So the Apple stock, which you paid 50 for and worth 150, your basis suddenly becomes 150. If grandma doesn't live the year, you get the stock back when she passes, your basis reverts to 50. If you're concerned about that and say, well, it may not be worth it, the way I fix that is I have grandma sign a will or amend a trust that says, if I die and I possess assets given to me by my child and I've lived more than 1 year from the time I got those assets, I return them to my child. If I haven't lived more than 1 year, I return them to my grandchildren. The grandchildren weren't the donors. They didn't give grandma anything. They get a fair market value at death basis. So you've accomplished the goal of the fair market value basis. So these are just planning things that we talk about. When we think about basis, as you are aware, I'm sure if you're in a community property state, when a person passes, both halves of your community property get a fair market value at death basis. That is way more favorable than in a non-community property state. When I have jointly held property in a non-community property state, the survivor's basis is half the value at the death of the joint tenant and half the original cost. So that's not as good as community property, obviously. So that's a big advantage that people in community property states have. We have something called a SLAT. It's a complicated planning technique, but what it does is it takes advantage of the use of the exclusion for gift purposes while it's available. The way the SLAT works, without getting into all the complications, spouse A creates a trust for spouse B, funds it with as much of the exclusion as spouse A is willing to use, let's say up to $12 million, and does not elect the marital deduction. Why? Because now spouse A has used his or her exclusion. And if the exclusion goes down in the future, whether through political change before the sunset, whether as a result of the sunset, whether the sunset or beyond, whatever happens, you've used your exclusion. You didn't fail to use it. If you leave everything to your spouse, the marital deduction will apply, but now the reduced exclusion is available in the future, not the current one. So we try to set these up. If A sets up one for B, B may want to set one up for A, and this is where you get into the technical issue of don't let them be reciprocal, meaning don't let the trust A creates and the trust B creates be identical. What we do here is we set them up in different states. We set up one in California, one in Nevada. We use different trustees, the California trustee, the Nevada trustee. We put different terms in the trust. Maybe children get the property when they're 50 in one trust, and they don't get it ever in the second trust. It goes to their children. We make them different. People say, well, what happens if the spouses divorce? Well, we can address that. We can put language in these documents that says if there is a divorce, a trustee can name spouse A, the original donor, as a new beneficiary of the trust. Or we can have a provision that says if the spouses get divorced, only the person currently married to spouse A is a potential beneficiary. We can fix the issues of divorce if that comes up. One of the tools we love to use in planning is called the general power of appointment. What we do here is we set up a trust and we say that a trustee or a trust protector in the future can give a beneficiary the right to have a general power of appointment. What does a general power of appointment do? It puts the property in the person's estate. A trust initially may not put it in the person's estate. So we wait and see what's going to happen in the future. What will the law be years down the road? What will the wealth of that trust beneficiary be? If that person is going to have a taxable estate under future law, don't grant them the general power of appointment. The property will not be part of their estate. If they will not have a taxable estate, grant them the general power of appointment. The inclusion in their estate, if that law doesn't change, will create a fair market value at death basis. So you can see what we're focusing on here is estate planning and income tax planning at the same time. What's the basis of your assets if you want to sell, capital gain, loss issues? What is the estate and gift tax consequence of what you're doing? A dynasty trust is a wonderful planning technique where you set up a trust for multiple generations. Everyone gets a life estate, income for life, principal in the trustee's discretion. Your spouse, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, multiple generations beyond. The only limitation would be how long your state law lets a trust last. California is a short rule against perpetuity state, meaning the trust can only last lives in being when you create the trust plus 21 years. A Nevada trust can last 365 years. A Wyoming or Florida trust can last 1,000 years. A South Dakota trust can last forever. And the states I mentioned have exceptionally favorable income tax laws that do not tax trust income. So we have a lot of opportunity here in planning. Another advantage of a long-term dynasty trust is asset protection. How do you know whether your children or grandchildren or great-grandchildren will be pursued by creditors, judgment creditors, financial creditors, matrimonial creditors in a divorce? We can't know that. But this trust says these assets can't be touched because the beneficiary doesn't own them. They are simply using them. Think about life insurance issues. If a client has a life insurance policy, ideally it should be in an irrevocable life insurance trust, because if you put your policies into such a trust and live 3 years, they're out of your taxable estate. People miss the fact that life insurance is part of their estate if they control the policy. Well, if the exclusion drops to $7 million and you've got $1 million or $2 million of policy, you've got a large percentage absorbing your exclusion by life insurance. Put it into these trusts. It's not part of your estate. That gives you that 7 million or whatever number we're going to be dealing with in the future as an available sum for other assets, real estate, securities, etc. So these are things you want to be aware of. Then we come to the Secure Act. The Secure Act, sadly, in 2019 has made using retirement plans the worst asset for tax planning. We only have 5 categories of folks now who can use their life expectancy for required distributions: a spouse, a minor child of the participant, disabled, chronically ill folks, or persons born within 10 years of the plan participant, typically siblings or significant others. Everybody else has this 10-year rule. You got to get the money out of the plan within 10 years of the time the participant died. Think about that in the context of a grandchild. Your 8-year-old grandchild is the beneficiary of $1 million plan. When he or she's 18, you get $1 million. How happy are you with that? Probably not. So we have to do new planning. We have to fix our planning. We can't allow for questionable beneficiaries these funds to automatically pass through over that 10-year period. These are concerns. Now, the IRS has further complicated things by issuing some proposed regulations that would complicate withdrawals. If you're 72 or over, your beneficiaries have to use their life expectancy for 9 years with the balance in year 10. If you're under 72, they can use any time they wish in 10 years. That reg is very unpopular and may not become law. We're using something called accumulation trusts that are designed to say the money goes into a trust, has to come out of the plan in 10 years, unless you're one of those categories of eligible beneficiaries. But the money can sit in the trust. We don't like money sitting in a trust because the trust income tax rates are terrible. In 2023, at $14,450, you're in the 37% bracket. You're not in that bracket as an individual, a married person, until something like $680,000. But if your beneficiary is someone that has issues, they have something going on, they're gamblers, they're alcoholics, they're drug users, you don't want to just hand them money. So you leave it in the trust and make sure that the trust funds are used to help them or protect them in some way. When we have trust distributions, they're ordinary income. So your young beneficiaries, your adult children who are at their prime peak earning years, you die when you're 80, your children are 50 years old or 60 years old, they're going to get distributions on top of their compensation. There's a big tax increase that has resulted from the Secure Act. So what are some planning things we can suggest to maybe mitigate that bad news? We can consider maybe converting to a Roth IRA. You pay the income tax now, and now all the withdrawals from the plan for the future are tax-free. You can take them out tax-free. You can leave them to your children. They have to take the money out over 10 years, but it's tax-free to them as well. So these are some of the things we're looking at. If this has been a poor year for your client as a person that's had a lot of losses and the value of their portfolio is reduced, what a good time to consider the Roth IRA. Hopefully things get better in the coming time, and so that appreciation will be very favorable because you've paid the tax at a low number. The future appreciation will be favorable. These are things we can think about. when we think about the Roth conversion, what else can we be doing? Well, remember, you can't reconvert. You can't go back now. If you make the decision, you have to live with it. But think about this. Who's going to pay the tax? Is the parent going to pay the tax, or are you going to leave the IRA to the children as a taxable asset and make them pay the tax? That's really what all my clients' decisions come down to. I can explain this till I'm blue in the face in my explanations. Finally, the bottom line is, are you willing to pay the tax now and write that big check, or will it be your children's problem when they survive you? And some clients say, let me deal with it now. It'll reduce my future estate by taking those tax dollars out of it, which might save me from being a taxpayer in the future. Other people say, I'm not comfortable writing that check. If I ever need the money, let my children worry about it. Either way is fair, but have that discussion with clients so they are brought to the table of understanding that these are options they should be thinking of. Last things I want to mention here as my time is running down. Think about year-end planning. What can we do year-end planning? We are at that point, of course. So if we have losses, harvest those losses, assuming we have gains. If you don't have gains, then hold on to your losses. Be careful with wash sale rules. I have clients that tell me they have losses in their portfolio this year. I'm suggesting to them, do you have low basis assets that are highly appreciated? You haven't sold them, but they're a lot more valuable than when you bought them. Sell those assets, they'll realize gains. You have losses to offset them, so you won't owe capital gain tax. If you're not selling something at a loss, you can buy it back immediately. So you sell the Apple with your $100 a share gain, you buy it back the next day, and now you have Apple with a much higher basis, if that's something you're willing to consider. You can't do that with losses. There's that nasty rule called the wash sale rule that basically says if you sell something at a loss, but you've bought it 30 days before the date of sale or 30 days after, you can't deduct that loss. You have to carry it forward. So those are some income tax things to do. One more income tax thought before I end. Something called a QCD, a qualified charitable distribution. This is a very popular planning opportunity for persons who are 72 years old or older and are required to take minimum distributions from their IRAs and possibly from their qualified plans. I say possibly because if they're an employee of that company with the plan and they don't owe 5%, they can wait to take their distributions from their qualified plans. IRAs, 72, you have to start taking money. So what do we suggest here? If you make a contribution up to $100,000 to a qualified charity, under current law, that's a public charity, not a donor-advised fund, not a private foundation. You make that up to $100,000 contribution. You don't have to take that IRA withdrawal into your income. You don't get an itemized deduction for it, but it counts as or toward your required minimum distribution. So let's say you have a client required to take $80,000 this year. If they take it out, it increases their adjusted gross income. They'll get an income tax deduction for taking it, and they've satisfied their minimum required distribution. But they increase their adjusted gross income. Where does that hurt them? It makes them more likely to be paying a net investment income tax based on your AGI. It makes them have a potentially higher Medicare premium for Part B and D of Medicare based on your AGI. If they don't take the money out and they simply use the qualified charitable distribution, it's not added to their AGI. They've satisfied their required distribution, and very importantly, they've made a generous gift to charity. There are a couple more slides in the presentation just talking about a few cases that came up addressing these things. Most importantly, to conclude, the most important thing we need to do in terms of tax planning for income tax and estate tax is be flexible. We don't know what's going on. There are going to be surprises. Maybe several people on one side of the aisle will join the other side and agree to tax increases or agree to tax reductions. We don't know that. So the more flexible our plan is, that's the better way to go. We have had for the last 20 or 30 years what I call, and many of my colleagues call, the golden age of estate and tax planning. We have been able, through tax planning, to save thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars of tax, legally and properly, using the techniques the law provides. How much longer are we going to be able to do that? We can take advantage of all of these opportunities today. There have been no laws passed yet that have taken away any of the things I've mentioned. Take advantage of the opportunity, get in front of clients, talk to clients, urge them to act wisely. Take advantage of what's being given us before it's not there anymore. With that, on behalf of RVW Wealth, thank you for having me part of your program. And now I'm going to turn over the discussion to Stefan.
Thank you very much, Steve and Andrew, for the timely and informative presentation. And on the topics that Steve discussed, here at RVW, we've been using many of these great estate planning strategies, including the upstream gifting he mentioned, which saves tremendous amount on taxes with step up in appreciated assets. But most importantly, here at RVW, we're always addressing and reviewing basic planning needs, which included wills, trusts, power of attorneys, updated beneficiaries. So please contact one of the RVW team members to address these important planning items. And on the topics that Andrew addressed, he asked a critical question, which was what companies can continue to operate in this environment as interest rates rise and the cost of businesses continue to go up as well. And here at RVW Investment Committee members, we're focusing on factors such as revenue growth, strong profitability levels, and dividend growth. And we're really just focusing on these type of rules-based methodology to tilt towards factors that tend to outperform over time. And in closing, I want to address one more of Warren Buffett's quote. He said that I never attempt to make money on the stock market. I buy on the assumption that they could close on the market the next day and not reopen it for 5 years. And our investment philosophy to stay diversified and again, tilt towards factors like profitability helps to address Buffett's investment approach. And as we approach the end of the year, we believe this is a great time to look back and forward on the analysis of investments and estate planning needs. So again, please contact your RVW team member. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a great week, everyone.